I am so honored to have two incredible writers, artists here on stage with me. Nilo Cruz, whose play you just saw, and Richard Blanco, who is the inaugural poet. It is a real treat to have them here. I also wanted to just say that Nilo is here. He opened a new play that he is working on. I don't know the name, so I'm going to ask you that.
I opened a new play last night called Lorca in a Green Dress, which has to do with Federico Garcia Lorca, which of course was assassinated during the Civil War in Spain. Is that better? Yeah. So did you hear me? It's a play that I opened last night. It's called Lorca in a Green Dress, and it has to do with Federico Garcia Lorca, the great Spanish poet who was assassinated in Spain during the Civil War. Where is the play? Oh, in Miami. I just came from Miami. Yeah, I actually went to sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning, got up at 5 to be here.
And I thought that we would start this. You've had an opportunity to hear Nilo's words, and I think that we should start with a little bit of Richard's words as well, just to put us in context.
Great. Well, thank you, Nilo. That was just absolutely beautiful. I was crying like a baby out in the, as many of us were. So I just tried to pick a couple of poems that I think had to deal with what we just saw in terms of themes of memory and place and longing and belonging and whatnot and journey. So this poem, which was one of the 3 inaugural poems that the White House asked me to read, has to deal with my mother's journey from Cuba. And my mother left her entire family behind in Cuba, met her 7 brothers and sisters, her parents, her every aunt and uncle, every niece and nephew and whatnot for the sake of that journey. Yeah, there's many layers to this, I think, as well as there was to what we just saw. But I think it's important because I've always felt that in some ways my mother was the one for that faith and that courage that she had in that journey is more of an American than I could ever be. And she really was the one who almost should have been the one to read that poem in Washington, not me. This is fundamentally part of, I think, what the American spirit is about. So, mother country, madre patria. To love a country as if you've lost one. 1968, my mother leaves Cuba for America, a scene I imagine as if standing in her place. 1 foot inside a plane destined for a country she knew only as a name, a color on a map, or glossy photos from drugstore magazines. Her other foot anchored to the platform of her patria, her hand clutched around one suitcase, taking only what she needs most. Hand-colored photographs of her family, her wedding veil, the doorknob of her house, a jar of dirt from her backyard, goodbye letters she won't open for years. The sorrowful drone of engines, one last deep breath of familiar air she'll take with her. One last glimpse at all she'd ever known. The palm trees wave goodbye as she steps onto the plane. The mountains shrink from her eyes as she lifts off into another life to love a country as if you've lost one. I hear her. Once upon a time, reading picture books over my shoulder at bedtime, both of us learning English, sounding out words as strange as the talking animals and fair-haired princesses in their pages. I taste her first attempts at macaroni and cheese, but with chorizo and peppers. And her shame over Thanksgiving turkeys always dry, but countered by her perfect pork pernil and garlic yuca. I smell the rain of those mornings huddled as one, under one umbrella, waiting for the bus to her 10-hour days. And at night, the zzz, zzz of her sewing her own blouses. Quinceañera dresses for grown nieces still in Cuba, guessing at their sizes. And the gowns she'd sell to neighbors to save for a rusty white sedan, no hubcaps, no air conditioning, sweating all the way through our first vacation to Florida theme parks to love a country. As if you've lost one. As if it were you on a plane departing from America forever. Clouds closing like curtains on your country. The last scene in which you're a madman scribbling the names of your favorite flowers, trees, and birds you never see again. Your address and phone number you never use again. The color of your father's eyes and your mother's hair, terrified you could somehow forget these. To love a country, as if I was my mother last spring, hobbling, insisting I help her climb all the way up to the U.S. Capitol, as if she were here before you today instead of me, explaining her tears, her cheeks pink as the cherry blossoms coloring the air that day, when she stopped, turned to me, and said, "You know, mijo, I've been thinking. It isn't where you're born that matters. It's where you choose to die. That is your country." Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And this poem is sort of a flash forward in the sense of how sort of universal these themes of journey, memory, place, and loss and longing are. So that's, it's not just, in my particular case, it's not just about being a Cuban or a parent of Cuban exiles, but a long time ago I went back to this place that was a place out of my childhood, Marco Island on the west coast of Florida, thinking I'd take that trip down memory lane, and the layer of memory was really interesting for me in the play. This idea, does the writer write about memory, does not write about memory, and that complex, that complexity surrounding that. So I went to Marco Island thinking nothing had changed in 30 years, because of course, in our minds, we keep things the same. And of course, everything did change. And in a way, Marco Island became my Cuba, in the sense that I was, in my own lifetime, in my own context, I was understanding this idea of loss and place and memory and how those things, and even though it wasn't a Cuban story in a way, it wasn't my mom's story, and it became my story as well in another context. Looking for the Gulf Motel, Marco Island, Florida. There should be nothing here I don't remember. The Gulf Motel with mermaid lampposts and ship's wheel in the lobby should still be rising out of the sand like a cake decoration. My brother and I should still be pretending we don't know our parents as they roll the luggage cart past the front desk, loaded with our scruffy suitcases, 24 loaves of Cuban bread, brown bags bulging with enough mangoes to last the entire week, our espresso pot, the pressure cooker, and a pork roast reeking garlic through the marble lobby. All because we can't afford to eat out, mijo. Not even on vacation. Only 2 hours from my home in Miami, but far enough away to be thrilled by the wider sands on the west coast of Florida, where I should still be, for the first time, watching the sunset instead of rise over the ocean. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My mother should still be in the kitchenette of the Gulf Motel, her daisy sandals from Kmart still squeaking across the linoleum, still gorgeous in her teal swimsuit and amber earrings, stirring a pot of arroz con pollo, adding sprinkles of onion powder and dollops of tomato sauce. My father should still be in a terry cloth jacket, smoking, clinking a glass of amber whiskey in the sunset at the Gulf Motel, watching us dive into the pool, 2 sons he'll never see grow into men who will be proud of him. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My brother and I should still be playing parcheesi. My father should still be alive, slow dancing with my mother on the sliding glass balcony of the Gulf Motel. No music, only the waves keeping time. A song only their minds hear 10,000 nights back to their life in Cuba. My mother's face should still be resting against his bare chest like the moon resting on the sea. And the stars should still be turning around them. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My brother should still be 13, sneaking rum in the bathroom and sculpting naked women from sand. And I should be 8 years old, dazzled by seashells and how many seconds I can hold my breath underwater. But I'm not. I'm 38, driving up Collier Boulevard, looking for the golf motel, for everything that should still be, but isn't. I want to blame the condos, their shadows for ruining the beach in my past. I want to chase the snowbirds away with their tacky McMansions and yachts. I want to turn the golf courses back into mangroves. I want to find the golf motel exactly as it was and pretend for just a moment that nothing I've lost is lost. Thank you.
We're going to open it up and talk a little bit about how you do what you do and what inspired you. I will start by asking both of you, what made you start writing and what made you start writing about what it is that you do, which is both so it's similar in its nature. And Nilo, do you want to go first?
Well, for me, it was through reading. I was very young. I moved to this country when I was 10 years old, and I was going to an elementary school here in Miami, and
Speak up a little.
And I was working. I volunteered at the library to shelf books because I wanted to be close to books, and I discovered a poem by Emily Dickinson, a book of poems by Emily Dickinson, and completely fell in love. And I thought to myself, this is what I want to do. I want to write poetry, or I want to be a writer, period. And it wasn't until much later, working at a hospital in Miami, that I had an epiphany that I wanted to be in the theater. I wanted to go to the theater that evening, and I went to the local theater, the original theater back then, which was Coconut Grove Playhouse, and I saw a play called The Dresser. And, and immediately, when I left the theater, I thought to myself, I want to start taking theater classes. And I didn't know what capacity. I didn't know if I wanted to be an actor. I didn't know if I wanted to be a director or a writer, but I knew I wanted to be in the theater. And then somehow, when I was taking those theater classes, I had a brilliant teacher who started to, I was writing scenes in class, and she said to me, "You're a writer. You should be writing for the theater, and you should be directing as well." And that's where everything started for me. And writing always changes. I mean, I find that writing is about observing human behavior, also taking into account history. For me, especially beauty, because I think that beauty is always seeking justice, and I'm interested in justice more than anything, and this is the reason why I wrote this play, the story of Benedetta, and because I felt that it was a story that needed to be heard, and there was a justice that she hadn't quite found in her life, and I wanted to shout into the world what happened with many of these refugees and how this history keeps on repeating itself.
I think I'll go backwards, but thinking about that, one of the things that motivated me to become a poet, and still motivates me is this idea of emotional historian. That there are so many stories, both our stories as our community, but stories in the world that no newspaper or magazine or Muse or CNN or Fox, whatever, that the art tells the true story of humanity in a way that nothing else can. And so I've always felt that part of the artist's job is to make sure that that history, that emotional history, is put down. I came to writing late when I was about 25, mostly because of my socioeconomic and cultural circumstances. I studied engineering first and have been an engineer all my life. But in my house, we weren't talking about Picasso around the dinner table or anything like that. But also my parents didn't even know who the Rolling Stones were. It was like, so even if they wanted to sort of support or have a conversation about it, was the art of Cuba or the artists or poets or writers or painters of Cuba. And so that kind of just set me on a path, but I'm kind of glad I came to writing a little bit later in life, because I saved myself a lot of really bad high school poems, really bad angst poems. But I think telling stories is ultimately still what motivates me, and that story has grown bigger as I get older and see more of the world. And before, it was really, really important for me to document the emotional history of the Cuban American generation, and also my parents and grandparents, and that whole exile story, and what did that mean, not from a political point of view, but in a way also to doing, as you said beautifully, that beauty does justice, because at the end beauty is truth, right? And it tells all the layers of the stories and all the complexities of it. But that's still what motivates me today still.
How do you find home? How do you create home? And when that home becomes something that changes, what do you do about it?
Go see the play.
Well, I mean, I must say something. Artists really live always in the periphery. So I always feel like I've always felt like an outsider. Not only because I was born in Cuba and came to this country when I was very young, and my sensibility is very different. But I also feel that being an artist keeps me detached from the world, because more than anything, I am an observer. So home to me is really those intimate moments. It's no longer Cuba. Of course, it's the United States, because I love this country. And this country has been very good to, extremely good to my people, and especially my family and me. But more than anything, home for me is really my work, is the fact that I can create all these worlds, that the world of the imagination, and I can have Mebadette, meet her lover, even though her lover was disappeared. And to me, it's like, what better place than to have a home that you can just recreate or create from nothing, and be protected by your own imagination, and no one can censor that. No one can stop you from creating from the imagination, from the world of imagination. So that's home for me.
Yeah. Interesting times. I should say that home is like asking what is love, right? There is no final answer. And that's why topics like this is what artists take up, because it's not always about finding a resolution, but it's about dimensioning, asking questions, answering those questions, and asking new questions. So home, and the idea of home, is something that's never quite, it's like a mirage that always slips through our fingers, and with incredible layers of complexity. I do, in response to your comment, I have been saying, don't leave, because we need you to stay more than ever in this country, I think. So that's one thing. But I think what's also happening is that the narrative of home, and the narrative of home in this country that we're listening to, has been slowly over the decades just placed in the narrative of politics, and not in the narrative of the people-to-people story, which is what artists try to do, is bring that really abstract narrative, which is just a bunch of talking heads, and bring it down to the real stories of people to people. And we seem to be only able to talk to each other lately through politicians. And I think those are the questions that I'm asking now, that are a little more than just this or that for me, to leave or stay, or those kinds of things. I think we as a people need to start listening to each other. But I think this is also giving us an incredible opportunity to get back to those human stories and try to have conversations with people that we might have not had conversations with for many, many, many years, and try to figure out together, a little bit more together, what that word home means in terms of our nation, in terms of the world, really, because it's not even just a national question. This is a narrative that is, I think, as you see the fluidity of people and places, and I mean, look at what we're seeing in Syria is kind of the same, as the same, people being turned away, or this potential. So I think we need to figure out that narrative and that question, and it changes from time to time, from generation to generation, from circumstance to circumstance. But yeah. Makes me feel better.
I'm just going to add in that it was also this week, it was such a pleasure to be coming in and getting to work on Nilo's play in here and say we're making something that brings people together, to be in the rehearsal room with a bunch of young students working on Charles Dickens language and bring people together to collaborate. And that's what artists do, is allow us to come together. So I'm going to rephrase the question and correct me if I'm wrong on this, that when we're looking at the work of both of these writers, it is work that is political, but there's clearly an aesthetic that is a driven artistic aesthetic. And where do you draw from to get your hope, to be inspired?
I mean, I think with every play is different. And when I enter a play, I usually, I'm interested in characters more than anything. I don't enter a play with a fixed idea of a theme or an argument that I want to make. To be honest with you, I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in creating pamphletic work. So I encounter the politics of the play. I encounter the world of the play as I write. But I more than anything begin with characters, and then I let the story take on its own form. And then I figure it out. To me, it's about exploration more than anything. To me, it's about being a traveler and not being a tourist. A traveler really explores. A tourist just goes to the very specific sites, to the known and what's been told, what he learns or she learns through travel books. But when you become an explorer, you go into territories that have been unexplored. And I'm interested in those journeys as a writer. So again, it changes with every play that I'm writing about. And of course, I do research. Obviously, for this play, I had to do an enormous amount of research, and then I forgot all the research that I sort of made it mine and let it sift through me.
I think I have a similar response. In the sense that I have really a strong belief that really the real history to be told, the real story where we can find hope is in the narrative of the people, de la gente, no? And getting back to actually Lorca, in the sense of Lorca would look towards gypsies for inspiration, and to me that's what sort of keeps me going. That despite these layers of political rhetoric or harsh sort of narratives, there's another narrative that's always being written, and that is the story of the people. And one of the things that people often say when they go to Cuba for the first time, they're so amazed by how welcoming and friendly and embracing Cuban people are on the island, because we've been fed this tour guide sort of version that we are in this Cold War sort of country, and that's another narrative. But down to the people, the real stories of my cousins, of my mom, of my aunts, that people are people. And if you look throughout history, to me, that's where the hope lies. That despite the wars, that despite the atrocities and the genocides, and despite all this other layer, that somehow we survive. And somehow we collectively survive with hope and find the strength make sense out of something like we just saw, right? At the end, the story of finally having some kind of closure. And to me, that's the magic of art, is finding, for me, it's a little more personal as a first-person narrator and a poet in poetry, but even I feel like I'm the narrator of other people's stories as much as my own, and believing that that is really, that's where I find my sense of hope, in the little good morning at the coffee shop, in the ways that we, the smallest ways that we connect in human being, and opening a door for somebody, and as the world, continues to grow even more interconnected, and that story becomes more the political narrative becomes more complicated, and so does ours in some ways. But I think, that's ultimately where it lies for me.
How do you choose your stories?
Well, I think part of it, again, I go back to human behavior. I think, you want me to tell you my process? Would that be helpful? Well, I sit down in the morning, I close my eyes, and I try to create images. I try to imagine a character, and through me, it's all about visualization. And so I see the character, and other characters are inhabiting the same world, and that causes me to do research. So I do some research. That causes me to come back to the writing and do some more writing, then causes me to go out into the world. And when you are creating, everything becomes a magnet. You're searching, you're in a moment of meditation. I don't know if you've ever met a writer. And when I was in graduate school and college, I remember studying under writers that were also professors, and I could tell when a professor would come to class, and I could tell when that professor had been writing. There was something dispersed about the eyes, the way they would look at me and say, "Oh, I could tell he or she was writing." And the same happens with all of us who are writers, artists. We are constantly, we become magnets, and we're constantly searching for things, whether it's through research, or whether it's with our environment and the news, and we take all these ingredients, and at least I do, and that's how I create my work. It's a very complex and very desolate, very solitary world that we've chosen for ourselves. Sometimes I feel like I'm a monk, to be honest with you. I sort of cease to exist with ordinary life, and because again I'm searching for answers.
In terms of that being a monk, you're working in the theater, so you've got to deal with the me's, you've got to deal with the actors. And what is that like when you, as an artist, you have this vision and hear these words in the way that Richard was able to read his poetry? What happens when suddenly those words are in somebody else's
Well, that's the best
voice?
part about working in the theater, is that you're solitary, and then you come to the theater and you share with a group of designers, with actors, and then you're open. It's a very generous art form. It's not about what you just do when you're in a closed room. It's about how they interpret your work as well. And you really have to be very generous as a playwright as well, because it is about interpretation more than anything. And not only it's curious, is not only what these other artists are, how they're interpreting the play, but how time is interpreting the play. I think this play has a different kind of resonance nowadays than it had when I wrote it years back, obviously. And I didn't intend that, but it's curious what time does to a work of art and how it frames it.
You want to add something?
A couple of ideas in terms of process too, and I think we're talking about also how we incorporate sort of ideas or not ideas, but for a poet in particular, one sure sign, I don't go to an idea first, or I'm going to say, I'm looking for this story particularly because I want to prove X, Y, or Z. But it's you just enter with an emotional sort of guiding system, and you just, and curiosity and like meditation, it is sacred. It's like this sacred sort of space you enter. But whenever you put the idea before the work of art, it usually is a complete flop. I mean, I can tell for me, you know, whenever I know what the poem's going to look like, I'm like, oh, I know exactly what I want to write about. Let me throw it away. I mean, I'll start, but I have to get to someplace else. Artists live in mystery. And one thing that our mutual friend Carlos Betancourt, a visual painter, has always said to me was, so to be an artist is to be part of something that does not exist yet, and that is in a very interesting space to be in. And it's because we're in that monastic space and that meditative space that new connections can happen. And we're often, I don't know about you, Nilo, but I feel sometimes just also sort of like a conduit. And you know, and then at some point you know your craft well enough that you start, I stumbled, now I can start stitching and pulling and being more purposeful. But it's just hours of rehearsing and practice that create an instinct, and that instinct leads us through curiosity, through intellectual and creative curiosities into things, into stories. And those are usually the best pieces that come through.
How did Nilo use magic realism within the play and then make it so that an American audience who isn't used to that sort of structure, so that they could follow it and stay with it? And did he have to tweak what he was doing?
Was that hard to make those tweaks for him?
Well, I mean, I don't really like the term magic realism, although I love those writers that have been termed as magic realists, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and many others from Latin America. I actually prefer the term realism that is magical. So I start with a reality, and then I try to race it to, I run with it and try to be imaginative with it, because I think the imagination is our strongest tool as writers and also as human beings, period. So again, I start with a reality, and then I sort of expand it, but maybe it's just part of, maybe it's just the legacy that we have in Latin America from Spain, from Cervantes and Don Quixote and the rest of the works. So for me, it's second nature. But it's curious because it seems like North American audiences are very receptive to the work that I'm doing, because it is, in some ways, it has aspects of realism that is magical, but it's still very rooted in a very specific kind of reality. I just have flights of poetry and lyricism, again, because I'm interested in beauty, and beauty more than anything is about seeking justice.
So have either of you gotten to go to Cuba recently?
I was at the reopening of the U.S. Embassy in August 14th, about a year and a half ago, where I got to read a poem. And that was I had been to Cuba many times, mostly to see family, to see that half of my mother's family that I grew up without and whatnot. It's an interesting and very complex relationship, and it depends when you came, who, like you said you came at 10, right, Nilo? So his perspectives and things might be sort of not completely different, but certainly have other dimensions. To me, right now, Cuba it's always changed. That idea of home and my connection to it is always continuously changed. Right now, I'm in a position where I've kind of come to the conclusion that I can die in two places. I've always, till the embassy, which was, of course, something that I never thought would happen in my lifetime, I always thought I still had to pick or choose, pick between one or the other. Either had to be Mr. Cuba or Mr. United States. And the contrast between being an inaugural poet and finally feeling a sense of America, a real place sort of at that American table for myself, for so many like me that I represented indirectly or directly in that moment, in that role, it was really interesting to do the sort of switch and go like, wait a minute, you know, again, home is a very complex question. It's almost 2 years to the date, was this sense of, number one, and now I start to question and realize, am I even Cuban enough for Cuba, right? Because I've realized that even though I've really gone to see only, in a way, what I want to see, my family, but I've realized that the country itself has evolved, well, whatever you want to think about it, but it's its own country that in a way has slipped from my fingers as well as my parents. And so I'm sort of now that the possibility or the potential of actually having a real, authentic, honest, and legitimate relationship with the island, one that's unencumbered, potentially, because we're not there yet, is something I feel like I have a lot of catching up to do and understanding Cuba and the Cuban people, even though in some ways, in the eyes of many, I should know all this stuff. So I'm sort of learning to evaluate Cuba on its own terms. And it's still sort of a very sort of, we have a lot more history and understanding of the island than most people who go are curious about the island. And it's still a bittersweet thing to me. It's not completely politically resolved. It's much more complex than, of course, again, the narrative of the media and the narrative of the political narrative on that side and on this side. And then there's the real story of the people. And so I encourage people to find that real story when they go to Cuba and think about what's really happening, what really has happened and what's really happening. And I'm kind of in an exploratory mode of continuing to find what those stories are.
Well, I left in 1970. I'm giving away my age, like Bernadette. Yeah, 1970. I went back in 1980 because I had left with both my mother and my father, and my two sisters had stayed behind. They had gotten married, and we didn't see them for 10 years, so that's when I went back to Cuba. And ever since, I've only had virtual rendezvous with Cuba, meaning my work has been done in Cuba. There was an artistic exchange between Miami and Havana, and part of it was they did a production of my play Out in the Tropics, and half of the cast was from Cuba and half was from Miami. And I was asked to go with the production, but I decided not to go because I felt it was going to be a little too much for me in terms of dealing with the play, but also dealing with the history, and also because it's my place of birth, and also because of the history that my family has had with Cuba. I don't come from a rich family, a middle class family. Actually, my family was of working class, so we did not lose properties like many of those Cubans that are very bitter and angry. But my father was in prison for 2 years. I was 2 years old, and I didn't get to see my father until I was 4 years old. And after he left prison, he was a marked man. First 10 years of my life, I lived through the repression that existed in Cuba, especially then. And I could not wear the color olive or the color green for many years because it reminded me of the military presence in Cuba. So, I mean, and those memories are still there. So for me to go back, I'm not prepared for it. I think I do want to go. My daughter was just in Cuba, and she encouraged me to go. But I felt that at the time when my play was being done there, that it was it was going to be an array of emotions, and I just wasn't ready for it. I want to go, but not as an artist. I just want to go as an expatriate who goes back to his country, and I want to walk through the streets where I that I run when I was a child, and sort of have that meeting with the place of my birth, and but not under the circumstances. I felt it was just going to be too much. But I look forward to it, and I think it's great that Cuba is opening up to the United States and vice versa. This should have happened a long time ago. And so I think it's very healthy. And hopefully it would have a good outcome. Ability.
Going to the U.S. Embassy sort of and being in that moment, like I said, was a turning point. It made me realize a couple things. One, that, there, more than even in my lifetime, even when you go to Miami, the whole idea of immigration, number one, has changed, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. But in Miami, my cousins come from Cuba to Miami, and 6 months later, they're like Skyping with their family in Cuba, right? And like that, I just give you that as a very personal example. But the idea that we are connected globally in ways that that I've seen in my lifetime, in terms of economies, in terms of communication, in terms of even biologically, right? I've had students who, my father is from Slovenia, and my grandmother's from here, and my this or that, and you were born in 2000 what? And again, there's this narrative that I think that's also happening globally, is that we are becoming more interconnected, and the idea of being an immigrant has also changed over time. That it's not that same, getting on a ship and that's it, you turn. It's not even sort of my mother's narrative anymore in that sense. So I think that's how I've dealt with it, and thinking that more of myself, of trying to think of myself as a global citizen and having global responsibility, that it's not just about the issues of Cuba that I care about or whatnot, but that really, what is that larger narrative? Not just of my personal biographical narrative that I have access to, but this larger idea that in some ways, this world, despite the other narrative that keeps we see this pendulum swinging of more tighter control on that narrative. Whoever controls the narrative controls the thoughts of the people, right? But the underlying narrative to me is that we are becoming one people. And this is a narrative that no one person has control over, but that it seems these two things are really contradictory I'm sort of choosing to use always my Cuban heritage and my experience as a base for understanding and informing, but I'm also writing poems about things that I never thought I would ever write poems about, things about Angel Island on the East Coast, on the West Coast, which was like the Ellis Island of Chinese American immigration. I feel I can own that now, because the experiences, regardless of the cultural experiences, the experiences at the heart, and this is what art gets to, at the heart, what we just saw emotionally here is we all feel. We didn't have to be from Germany. We didn't have to, to read a poem. You don't have to be Cuban, and so I've given myself permission to sort of get into those stories as well. Hopefully it doesn't come across as appropriation, but getting to the core emotional center of the human condition, right? These are stories of journey and stories of exodus and stories of exile are part of this narrative from the dawn of time, since the first caveman thought, hey, that cave looks better over there, It's been like that. And I've given myself permission. So I think we've reached the same conclusion. I hold it with great pride. A lot of people are always like, don't you hate being called this or being called that? And I'm like, I may be the only moron, but I love my labels in that sense. I own them, though. I own them. I'll tell you what's the story. I'll tell you what the stories are behind these labels, versus having no labels. Then who's telling that story? And so I think we're on the same page.
The question really is whether you're Republican or Democrat, whatever your beliefs are, how do we move forward?
As an artist,
because
they're artists.
How do we move forward from here?
They're artists.
But as a human being, how do we move forward from here?
Someone asked me this last week, and not in the same exact way, but there was a couple things, and one that came up for me is to really understand history. To really understand not to understand your story and where it really comes from. And to me, not just to be given this moment as if, we're just in this space here, as if this didn't come from decades before, and also imagine time and space moving forward. To be grounded in history, and so that you realize that, to me, that gives a little bit of information, a little bit of solace, a little bit of perspective, dimension, to be able to move forward as artists. I think, and I'll say this again, that I think the arts in general, whatever we can do to bring, like you just said, you brought the play to, whatever we can interject art into a conversation that depoliticizes and depolarizes things, and lets us see that at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We're all human beings with our own mistakes and our twisted, our twisted thoughts and our great thoughts and all that. And I think that's the only sort of saving grace, is to do your art. I mean, and do it in the most authentic and authentic and honest way that you can. And I think, I think you just need to have faith that will make a change. But yeah, beyond that, I can't, I don't have an 18-point plan for you.
Well, it's very difficult to answer that question because I'm still trying to digest everything, to be honest with you. I'm sort of, it's terrible what I want to say, but I was sort of grateful that I was immersed in a play, because I just could not, at that moment, it was very difficult to face reality. And it's difficult to even say this commentary, because I don't want to offend anybody and your political inclinations. And to be very frank with you, the word hope to me at this moment seems very inactive, and we have to be active. Hope is
just a word.
It's just a word.
Right.
We have to be active in. We have to take action, and I don't think it's about demonstration. It's about maybe listening to each other a little bit better. Again, that's a cliche that we've been listening to the past few days. But I think more than anything, we have to meditate on and look at the little moments in life and try to be better at what we do. Because every little action really counts. And if you're good with someone who's close to you, and take that into consideration. Not just look at the big picture, but really look at the little moments in life, and hold on to those little moments, and be active in all your actions, and that really can make a difference in the long run. I think right now we feel so disarmed with everything that has happened, and not all of us, but I do, I should say. It's not a good feeling, but that's because we're looking at the big picture. So we really need to just really go back to our center, and again, and practice generosity more than anything with each other, and that would really lead us to, that would have repercussions.
I'd also just like to share that art needs to be shared, and that all of you coming here and participating, all of you coming to see the work that Nilo produces, reading Richard's books, that's what needs to happen too. So thank you for being part of the process. Thank you so much for coming here to Portland Stage. It's great to see you.